Well, thanks everybody for joining us today. I'll go ahead and get started. My name is Sally and I work at Practical Farmers of Iowa. And joining me today is my coworker Jorgen. He'll be behind the scenes making sure that the tech runs smoothly. And I'm really excited to have on Dale Nimrod, and he'll have some expertise from Karl Knudson and Matt Roberts. We are talking about a really important topic today, so thank you so much for joining us. As you all probably know, beginning farmers are really urgently needed here in Iowa. We're going through a monumental transfer of farmland. This is because our current population of farmland owners is aging. Over 60% of Iowa farmland owners are over the age of 65, and 35% are over the age of 75. What this means is the situation is currently there's many farmland owners who are considering their plans for the future of their farmland. At the same time, we're seeing an eagerness in the beginning farmer generation, young and old, of quite a swath of people who are interested in farming. They're very eager and very excited about that prospect. However, one of the biggest barriers to them being able to farm is the prohibitive cost of farmland. So today, Dale is going to talk about how he has worked to reduce this barrier on farmland he has owned in the past and is currently working on now. Before we get started, I want to do my due diligence and thank our sponsors. We have quite a few sponsors who have chipped in to support what is this year a virtual field day season. Their sponsorship allows us this year to put on more than 60 virtual field days, and they are all free and accessible for you thanks to their generosity. I will really briefly talk about Practical Farmers of Iowa. If you are not familiar, our mission is to equip farmers to build resilient farms and communities. And we specialize in farmer-to-farmer education as well as farmer-led research. We invite you to learn more about the organization by going to our website, which is pictured here, practicalfarmers.org. We have a vast amount of resources on that website. So today, our event will run until 5:30. First of all, Dale is going to talk about what he has done to make land affordable for the next generation of farmers. Following that, lawyer Karl Knudson will weigh in on some of the tactics that Dale has used, and he'll talk about some other legal tools for farmland transfer. After that, financial planner Matt Roberts will reflect a little bit on potential tax implications of Dale's plan, and then we'll open it up for Q&A with all of you. And we would love to hear your questions. If you have clarifying questions, you are welcome to ask those during the presentation. If not, you can hold them until the end. We'll try to save plenty of time for question and answer. Asking a question is easy. As you can see on the slide, there's a small chat box at the bottom. You can click on that and simply say, I have a question. Or you can raise your hand and one of us, Jorgen or I, will unmute you to ask a question. Well, like I said, we'll take some clarifying questions along the way, and we'll save some for the Q&A as well, especially if we need to stay on schedule. If you don't want to say a question on the webinar, which we would love to hear from you, you can always type it into the chat box as well. And then at the conclusion of this event, we would love to get your feedback. This is our first season of virtual field days, and we know we have a lot to learn, and we would love to hear how we can make future virtual events better for you. So now we're going to get right down to it. We'll go right to Dale. Dale, thank you so much for taking time to share what you've experienced and your vision for the future today. I'll turn the reins over to you.
I'm unmuted. Good afternoon. Thank you for tuning into this event at 4 p.m. on a nice July afternoon. I guess you figure the corn will take care of tasseling itself without your immediate attention, so we can do this. Okay, I guess I'm all right. Thanks to the Practical Farmers of Iowa for hosting this and setting it up, and for the new hat they sent me, and I'm glad to be wearing that because I'm a proud supporter of PFI. I first became acquainted with the Practical Farmers of Iowa at a meeting of the Center for Rural Affairs in Nebraska that I was attending, and learned about Practical Farmers of Iowa. So that was when I first became acquainted with it, but I've become more acquainted with it since we transferred our farm in southwest Iowa to our home place to Mark and Melanie Peterson. And that's what I'm going to be talking about today. And Mark, as many of you probably know, was president of PFI, became president of PFI after we made that transfer. So today my assignment is to discuss what we went through to work this out with Mark and Melanie, and then to discuss that. And then I want to discuss a second farm transfer that's taking place as we speak. We're moving to town. And I worry in talking about transferring farms that y'all think I'm a land baron. So Jorgen, if you could show a picture of our retirement plaza here, it'll sort of make the point that the next one, there we are. I've got a thing right in the middle of my screen, but I guess you can see it okay. I'll keep looking at the television camera, but that's because I feel very uneasy about thinking that I'm a land baron. I'm not. Trust me, you can hear me on out. The agenda shows me discussing the first transfer first, and then I'll go on to the second. But I think it's very useful to you and to all of us that we see that the second one is not just a variation on the first one. These are two different things. And I think it is helpful to have both situations in mind when you hear, when I talk about each one. Both will probably sound familiar, but they are very different and require quite different strategies to work with here. Both will involve the concept of production value. You'll probably not hear me make much mention of market value. So here's situation one, the Stanton farm on which I grew up. My mom and dad, if you want to show the picture of my mom and dad and my brother and sister, Jorgen, we could do that. My mom and dad bought it in 1944 there we go, after spending 10 years on a rental farm that they had rented from the Nimrods up until that time, as in 1944. And within 9 months of moving to the new place, my dad died. So without ever getting to farm it. I was 5, and you can see me with my thumbs up in the bottom there. But my mom made it work to stay on the farm. A young World War II vet moved in with us and farmed the place on shares. We 3 kids grew up and went to college and then headed off to 3 direction like kids do. Our mom stayed on, and the World War II vet continued to farm the place for the next 40 years. By 2005, we 3 kids were in our 60s, and it was clear that none of us, nor any of our 4 children, of our 3 children, were going to be coming back to Stanton. So it was time to sell the farm. Does that sound like a familiar episode here of when the time comes? 20 years earlier, Mom had transferred ownership to us 3 kids. So it was ours to sell. And we, like nearly every aging landowner I know, aspired to find a nice young family who would appreciate the land, the community, and the church, and would invest themselves in caring for all three. That ruled out selling it by auction. I was smart enough to realize that young rural families desiring to farm are not in a position to compete with other buyers in a typical land auction. So that's situation one: how to make a 240-acre farm be affordable to a young family who we didn't know, wanting to farm the land, just like my mom and dad. I'll discuss what we did to make it happen, but first I want to set up by contrast situation two. This is the one we're in right now as we're speaking here. This particular sibling, namely me, of the three kids from the Stanton farm, married a woman he met in college. Following graduate school in Ames, he took a job teaching chemistry at Luther College in Decorah, where he and his wife, Sunny, were able to rent a farmhouse on a 200-acre farm for $50 a month. 7 years later, the farm came up for sale and they bought it. And there they raised their three kids. So we've been here 53 years now. And I've been thinking about estate planning for a while. One of our kids and his wife would like to own our farm, live on it, participate in this community. Hooray! So that's the situation two. Does it sound familiar? You can see any number of big questions needing resolution, however. Different questions than come up with situation one. One thing in our situation is that our other two kids are tickled to death that the third one is interested in owning it and keeping it in the family. So we don't have to deal with squabbling, but much must be done to achieve fairness. And we've been getting help from professional people on that kind of a thing. So let's go back to situation one here, the one where we transferred my home place, or where we transferred, my brother and sister and I, to a young family that fit this criteria. So the first question I thought that came up was, how do you find a nice young family and make it be affordable to own? We were clear about the goal, and we were pretty committed to making it work because we're pretty darn appreciative of our parents, of the community in which we grew up, its people, and the church and the school it supports. This community and church took over for my dad in nurturing his kids and supporting our mother. So why not auction the farm off and give the money to the community? The answer is because it wouldn't be enough money. Stanton needs people and young families, not more money. So when I set about to find an appropriate family, the first call I made was not to a real estate agent or office, but to the pastor of this church in Stanton. And he identified Mark. There was an article written about this writer in Minnesota and kind of describing this situation. And when she was talking about this aspect, she used the sentence, "The Nimrods really lucked out when they got Mark Peterson and Melanie." She was very perceptive. That's hit it on the head. Well, how did we make it, how did we make it possible for the Petersons to be able to afford the farm? Did we give it to them as a gift or half price? No way. The answer gets credited with my brother Vance, who's not online here today, but I talked to a few minutes ago. Vance had located an Iowa State ag spreadsheet designed to calculate how much one could afford to pay for a farm, such that the payments could be made from its earnings. Basically, a business plan for the buyer. We sellers required the buyers, Mark and Melanie, to fill in the anticipated income and expense sheet on that spreadsheet. We examined their calculations, tacked on a modest extra, and that was the price. Pretty simple, really. A key word in the description of this seminar is production value. And in this case, the buyer was required to also do the calculations. The buyer had to do the calculations on this and meet with our approval. So we didn't try and figure out what was production value from our place. We made the buyer figure that out. We looked it over pretty carefully. So it's pretty accurate to say we sold the Petersons, we sold the farm to the Petersons for its production value, which meant it was affordable. Those two go hand in hand. What did we get in return? Much, much more than the dollars we would have gotten from a land auction, I think. A local buyer and a great citizen in Mark and Melanie. Now then, let's talk to situation, or move to situation number 2, which was how could we transfer ownership of our farm here in Decorah to one of our kids and still be fair to all 3. Does that sound familiar? It's a thing to deal with. Situation 1 to me seemed reasonably clear, and with a clear goal and a lifetime of associating with Lutherans, we figured out what to do on our own. It was equally clear for situation 2, Sonny and I were going to need lots of professional help. The financial advisor at our bank was very, very helpful in meeting with us, figuring us out what our goals were and so on. And luckily, my friend Karl Knudson, whom I've known since he was 10, is also my attorney. We'll be seeing him in a minute. We decided, Karl and I, to use our will as the vehicle for specifying how the transfer could take place. So writing the will and making the plans were kind of in the same thing. So the mechanism Karl designed and set up for the will was that our 3 kids would each inherit 1/3 of the estate that included the farm. Mom and Dad won't have to pay capital gains if they're dead. The mechanism describes how the son would be given the right to buy out the other 2 in a 20-year contract at a to be determined price and interest rate. To be determined means to be determined a week or a month after Mom and Dad are gone. So it depends. We're looking into the future, and that's what Karl helped put in. The price would be the production value. A fair interest rate would also be determined. So that's kind of the question in front here. How are we going to calculate those things when we don't know anything about what's going on? We certainly don't know anything about market value of land. That I expect to be about 110 when I pass on, and who knows what the value of land will be then. And with mom and Dad no longer living, and maybe Karl likewise, who and how determines the price and the rate of interest? Fortunately for you, Karl is with us today to describe what he devised. And fortunately for me, he will answer most of your technical questions. I barely understand this. But I need for you to appreciate the price and interest must be specified mathematically on data from a future date, from an unknown future date of the will, the date when the will, as the saying goes, matures. Very different for the seller asking the buyer to fill out a business plan to determine the price. Not long after Karl had done that work for us, we had it in the will, and the will was filed and signed and distributed and all of that kind of stuff. Not long after that, Karl suggested to me that he had written the price and interest section of that part of the will in a way that it would require little modification if one were to cut it out of the will and have the buyer use the calculated price and rate for whatever date you choose to buy it from mom and dad instead of buying while they're still alive, instead of buying it from the estate after they're gone. The same mechanism, the same calculations for price and rent, or price and rate would be there, the same thing on contract. I thought it was a really insightful piece of work that basically this scheme would work in both places. And it had some advantages. If we live to be 100, our son won't be an old man when he finally gets a chance to farm it and have it. And if we're not dead, there is this thing about but if we're not dead, then we can't overlook this thing called capital gains that we're involved in. And we'd rather die than pay capital gains, of course. But there are other tools that professionals like Karl know about in terms of pieces for this, trading for that, and doing some other kinds of things. Things I'd never even heard of, much less been able to understand. So I'm really, really glad Karl and Matt are here to say anything they want, but especially about any technical questions associated with how that could be done. We have actually decided to opt and pull the purchase mechanism from the will. So we went ahead and did that. And exactly how that is done in our particular case, I think is not as useful of a model for you to think about as when it was kind of integrated into the will. So it's kind of up to Karl whether he wants to talk about the way we are actually tinkering with it in this month, or whether the work he designed into the will kind of tells the story and gives the platform for dealing with that. So exactly how that's done, I think, is not as useful to you as to thinking about the general plan and for you to consider and what Karl wants to take through. But I think also then to learn about the tools that the professionals have to bring to bear, which is what is coming up next in this presentation. And I'm going to cut out here and see if we want to take any questions at this point, or whether we want to just go ahead and proceed and keep on going. We're a little bit ahead of time, so there is some time for that if you like. I'm going to unmute myself. I'm going to mute myself, Karl.
Thank you very much, Dale. That was very insightful, especially the goals that you set out for each parcel of land. I think that really helped you figure out what strategies to use. So I do see one question from Kim. So you are not going to sell to your son now?
We actually are going to sell to our son now, and that so we pulled that section of the will out and generally find it, but had to tinker with it quite a bit in order to deal with capital gains and a variety of these kind of tools that I think Matt and Karl are able to talk about to make it so to fit it a little bit more closely. So we actually did do that, but I'm not really describing what we actually did. I'm describing what we plan to do, which I think is a more general notion of how we dealt with the issue of productivity and affordability. The two are very close together depending on how you calculate productivity value. That's what, certainly with Mark and Melanie's case, the two both happened at the same time because we were in conversation about those calculations. When it's in the will, and then that is another dimension that would occur at another time. We actually use those formulas even for pulling it out of the will as one of the models for deciding what should we charge for it in 2020. And for a variety of reasons, we found some better ways of accomplishing that than what we anticipated in the will if we were gone.
Great, thank you for that clarification. Any other questions before we turn it over to Karl? I am seeing none. Thank you, Dale. And now, Karl, if you can elaborate more on some of those calculations Dale was talking about, that would be most excellent.
Okay, I'll maybe preface this by saying that there are a couple issues here that I'm mainly going to be focused on. The main issue is how do you go about calculating the production value of property. And what I did is I looked at what the rental value would be. And then I wanted to come up with a price that if somebody rented the farm out, they would be able to cover the interest and the property tax. Now, of course, if they're buying it, they're also going to need to pay some principal, but that's where their work and their sweat equity comes in. So I can maybe show you the formula on that. Now, I'll show you that in a minute. Then another issue that came up was, what if you want to sell the property for its production value during your lifetime instead of waiting until it can pass through the estate? And the issue there that Dale was kind of alluding to is that if somebody has owned a farm for a long, long time, there's a likelihood that they've got a very low tax basis, and if they sold it even only at its production value, there'd be a high capital gain tax to pay because there'd be so much appreciation in value. And so the solution to that part that we considered was that Dale would sell his homestead, that portion of the farm, to his son now, because the homestead can be sold without realizing a capital gain. And then the rest of the farm could remain to be sold under the provisions of the will at productivity value and at death. So in other words, the farm value would be stepped up in basis such that there wouldn't be capital gain at that point in time. And so that was one of the things that we were doing with that. Now, actually, in Dale's situation, his son is already on a farm and wanted to move to Dale's farm, and he had a son that wanted to move to his farm. And so we figured maybe we could do a like-kind exchange if we wanted to for some of the farmland, and that way there also can be an avoidance of capital gain, and then the grandson eventually could work something out. But I'll skip past all of that because that's not the primary focus of what we're doing here. And I'll take a look at how you can come up with a production value. And so I'm going to go to my share screen and see if I can get a hypothetical scenario here, which is different than Dale's, but you can maybe see some similarities. If I can get there, just a minute. Here we go. So in this hypothetical, you have a husband and wife. They're on a 160-acre farm. They have 3 children. Only child 1 is interested in taking possession of the farm and farming it. And the fair market value of the residence, $100,000. You don't worry about productive value with the residence because that's just the residence. But then the acreage, the fair market value of that is $1,120,000. This is just a hypothetical. And you put all that together, $1.22 million. And although child one is interested in continuing the farm as a family farm, he can't afford to pay that much because that price represents a lot of speculation value. And if he bought it for that price, he probably would have a rough time making the payments and would end up having to sell the farm in order to make things work. And so we're looking at figuring out a production value. And now if it's done through the will, and this is what this hypothetical is, and if there's 3 children, and if there's a sale of the property, one thing that'll help one of the children is that he'll be receiving 1/3 of the value of that farm as an inheritance. So he's really only going to need to pay for 2/3 of it. But it's still, it could be a heavy lift if it's at its speculation value instead of its production value. And so here is the one way to put some language in here that would explain how to come up with a production value. In the will, you'd give the one child an option to purchase at the production value, and you would, or productivity value of the farmland, and you'd define it that way. You'd start with the price of the residence, and you'd take that and set that off to one side because that doesn't really go into productivity value. Everybody needs a residence to live in, so you set that to the side. Then you take a look and try to come up with the productivity value of the farmland and outbuildings. And to do that, you start with find the annual gross cash rental value for comparable farmland in the locality based on a 5-year average using criteria established by the Iowa State Extension Service. That'd be one way. Now, another way, there can be variables here, would be just to look if the owner is already renting it out, you can just look at the actual rent instead of trying to, bring in some of these other figures that depend on corn suitability rating and this, that, and the other thing. But either way, it would be possible to come up with an annual gross cash rental value. At least if the owner was renting it in an arm's length transaction. Obviously, if the owner was farming it himself or running it to a relative for a low price or something, then you'd need to be looking at the gross cash rental value as established by other means. So you start with that, and you get that figure. Then you subtract from that the annual property tax that would have to be paid for that farmland. And then you divide that result by the interest rate, and then you need to come up with an interest rate somewhere in order to keep it kind of objective, so you're not just coming with something out of the blue. You could see what the interest rate would be that would be charged by the agribank, farm credit. So let's take a look at the application of this. Let's say that we have a residence that's valued at $100,000. We put that off to the side. Okay, now we've got the calculation of the productivity value. The average cash rental value in this hypothetical, let's say it's $24,200 a year. And then the annual real estate tax in this scenario, this is just all hypothetical so you can see how it works, $3,000 a year. And so then let's say the interest rate is 3.5%. Who knows what it'll be when the time comes. Okay, now we plug all these things into the formula. You have the cash rent, average cash rental value, $24,300. You subtract the property tax, $3,000, you come up with $21,200. Then you divide that by the interest rate, you get 605,714. You add that to the residence, you come up with a price of 705,714. Now, just to help you understand how all this works, I've got the same scenario, but I change the facts a little bit. Suppose the interest rate is 5% instead of 3.5%. Now you would have 24,000 minus the 300 minus 3,000, 21,200, divide by 0.050, and now you've got a lower price. And why is that? Well, if somebody is having to pay a higher interest rate on their 20-year contract, for example, because that's what you might have in the option to buy, is that they'd be buying it with a 20-year contract. If the interest is higher, they're going to have a harder time paying the contract off if you start with a higher principal amount. And in other words, the productivity value would be different. And so now you've got a total price of $524,000. And suppose that you have, let's start with that first option again. And now instead, we're using cash rent that's higher. The average cash rent turns out to be higher at the time, $30,000. We'll keep the $3,000 for the tax, just so you can see how these variables work together. We come up with $27,000, and then we divide that by that 3.5% interest. You remember we back at the earlier hypothetical, we did that and we came up with 605,000, added the residence. Okay, now with the higher cash rent, we come up with 771,428 plus 100,000, 871,428. And so it's a much higher price here that they would pay on the option. And the idea is that if somebody, let's say somebody was working off the farm and just needing to cash flow it without putting in any sweat equity, the cash rent would pay the interest on that contract. They'd still have to come up with their own money through work to pay the principal. You don't want to make it that easy that they just sit back and do nothing, but it would cash flow in terms of the interest. Now, let's go look at these scenarios again. And we have to remember that the child number one would be a beneficiary of the estate. So if in this first scenario, he's buying it for $705,714, and on a 20-year contract, then he would get a 1/3 interest himself. So he'd, in essence, be paying himself 1/3 of that. So it really would be 2/3 of that, or $470,476 that he would need to be paying his siblings in terms of the principal. Then he'd put that on an amortization table, a 20-year amortization table, and figure out how much is he going to be paying per month at that interest rate that we've used in our scenario. That at death there's 3.5% interest. What you'd come up with is $2,728 a month that he would need to pay that farm off in 20 years. And you multiply that by 12 months, that'd be $32,748 a year, which would be that $32,748 a year, we'd be looking at $21,200 would be covered by rent minus the property tax. So the other The other 11,000 or so, he would have to cover by earning it by his own sweat by farming the land, or he'd have to rent it out and work off the farm and live on the farm and pay it by his off the farm job. Either way. So that's the general outline of how I've shown to calculate the productivity value. Now, again, there are some things I'm not covering here in this presentation that might be important to some of you. First of all, there's a federal estate tax exemption that allows a decedent to leave up to 11.58 million in property this year, at least, without owing. That should be owing, not owning, federal estate tax, as long as it's, you know. And I'm hoping or guessing that most of you watching this don't have that type of an issue to deal with. If you do, I don't think what I'm suggesting here is going to help that or hurt it or do anything. Go see your lawyer about other ways to try to deal with that estate tax. There's something called special use valuation that isn't opted until death, and it's similar to what I've shown here in terms of utilizing productivity value. Also, Iowa inheritance tax, if you're watching from Iowa, provides a 100% exemption from inheritance tax for lineal descendants. So that's one reason I'm not really dealing with those issues here. If you have issues with estate or inheritance tax, then you can go talk to your attorney about that. Another thing I'm not dealing with here is the issue of wills versus trusts. And to be honest, you can do things with revocable trusts and so on to avoid probate or avoid probating in the same way. That's beyond this the scope of this discussion, but I do think that you could have a revocable trust that provides within it the same kind of language about providing that one of the children can buy at the productive value and putting in a formula for that. And then another thing I'm not discussing here is Medicaid lien avoidance issues. And those issues get complicated because there's a 5-year look back, and I'm not real keen on doing the Medicaid lien avoidance because you create a lot of problems. And anyway, I usually steer people away from that. Now, a standard simple will might just say everything in equal shares. And that's what Dale said, you know, we want to kind of do that, but also we want to give this option to one of the children to, instead of buying the farm at fair market value, or instead of the farm going on the auction block so everybody gets a third of the sale proceeds, give one of those children the option to buy it at productivity value, so you keep the farm in the family and so he can farm it and doesn't have to worry about speculation value. I guess another thing, I'm not sure how this is kind of a sample will that can be done this way and has sale price. But there can be some other issues. What if a portion of the farm is in conservation reserve program? Well, instead of the cash rental value, if you wanted to, you could put it in the will that you'd take the payments from the CRP and use those for the cash rental value for those acres. Or if you have some of the land in forest reserve, you can you know, bring in a forester and try to figure out what's sustainable in terms of forestry and what would that average out on an annual basis, and put that in for the forest acres. And then you can have all this, and it might seem kind of complicated, but you kind of encourage the children to stipulate to a productivity value so there doesn't have to be a hearing. So anyway, those are some of the issues that I'm touching on here, and I'll maybe open it to questions then. There might also be a question about what happens with the basis of the property if the estate itself is selling on contract to the 3 children, and then assigning that contract or to the 1 child, and then assigning the seller's rights in the contract to the 3 children, so they each have a 1/3 interest in the seller's rights that the estate had in the contract. And I think what would probably happen there is there'd be a stepped up basis for the estate, and then when the estate sold it for less than fair market value, it would have a loss, but it wouldn't be able to deduct the loss. And then the depreciation basis for the child that's buying the farm would be less, but if it's bare land, there's not going to be depreciation anyway. And then although with the buildings, that could be something of an issue. But then when that child finally sold the land, when he was calculating, if he ever did, instead of sending it on to his children and having a stepped up basis, then his, for purposes of gain and loss, the amount of loss that was disallowed at the estate level way back when his gain would be reduced by that amount. I think that's how that would work. You might want to check that further with a tax lawyer.
Well, that was extremely helpful to have those examples, Karl. Very complicated, at least for me, but extremely helpful. I just want to remind everybody on that we're going to have plenty of time for questions at the end, and you have quite an opportunity here with the expertise on this call. So please come up with your questions for a robust discussion at the end. If you have questions now for Karl that are clarifying questions, either chat them in the box or raise your hand. Well, you must have explained that very clearly, or else they're very overwhelmed, or maybe a little bit of both.
We do have a question from Jen Miller asking, where does one find appropriate rental values for infrastructure associated with the farmland?
Okay, one thing that can be done is, and you can find this by Googling too, but the Iowa State Extension Service does a lot of work in this area, figuring out average rental values, and depending on the quality of the land and whether it's pasture or corn land or this, that, or the other thing. And I think that it would have it would have a lot of information. So that would be probably my first stop. I suppose beyond that, if somebody wanted to, if the children weren't stipulating, they could check around other sources, but that seems to be the most scientific, best way to come up with some numbers on the average cash rental value. I mean, you probably, again, if it was being rented out already, then you'd have some numbers to work with that way. But if not, you'd have to check around. I imagine some farmland is going to rent for better than other farmland, and maybe a local expert could come in and kind of look and figure that out. But I think that there could be a lot of help from the Iowa State Extension Service in that regard.
Yeah, I think that is a good first step, for a good go-to for a lot of people, for at least the first step on that. Okay, great. Thank you, Karl. And I don't see any other questions right now. Jorgen is better at this text, so he might see some. Nope, not yet. So we're going to go ahead and go to Matt, and I hope everybody's preparing good questions for the end, and they can be related to this specific question or situation, or to your farm transfer, land transfer situations as well. So thank you, Matt, for explaining some of the potential tax and financial implications.
Thanks, Sally. So I'm Matt Roberts. I'm a financial planner at Sievers and Strigge in West Des Moines. And I've never met Dale or Karl before. So it was a pleasure to learn more about Dale's family history and these 2 farms, and learn about the work that Karl has done. And so very fascinating, and it sounds like you guys have done great work as it relates to the planning for these 2 farms. So just some observations. You know, I'm a financial planner, so we tend to be generalists. So this is kind of a non-legal and non-accounting opinion here. So my kind of synopsis of maybe we'll start with the first farm, the Stanton farm. Very fascinating, and so it sounds like this farm was purchased in 1944 by Dale's dad, and then he passed away 9 months after moving on to the farm, and then that farm then passed to his mother and was in her ownership. And so the basis in that farm, when it was transferred eventually on to Dale and his siblings, would have been that original basis from 1944, if I'm understanding the chain of events there correctly. And so if that farm was held by Dale's mother and then transferred or gifted to Dale and his siblings, that would have been Dale's basis then in that farm. And so when that farm is then sold to Mark and Melanie, that would be the basis. And then whatever that farm was sold for, if that was sold at the productivity value, as you may suspect, there's quite a bit of appreciation when that farm is sold. And so I don't know if Dale said this or not, so I apologize, but it's my understanding that that was sold as a lump sum. And if that were the case, that gain would be taxed in 1 year. And the tax rate for capital gains is a special rate. It's not the ordinary income tax rate. It's at 15%. And as you get to the top tax bracket, which is now 37%, that goes up to 20%. And you also have to deal with the Medicare surtax, an additional 3.8%. And so that, if it was sold lump sum, that capital gain would be assessed to that amount of gain on that farm. Now, if it were sold on an installment note, that gain could potentially be spaced out based on the term of the note. And then you'd have capital gain spaced out for 20 years, perhaps. And then the interest rate component on that note, let's say you were using a rate a bank would charge, or you're using the applicable federal rate or the AFR rate on that note, that would be taxed as ordinary income. The interest component would be taxed as ordinary income to Dale. And so that was an interesting chain of events. And but I think maybe the more interesting things I heard were on this farm in northeast Iowa in Decorah. And so Dale mentioned that he had purchased that farm after renting the house, the acreage there, purchased that farm. And one kid would like to buy the farm, and the two other kids are happy with that scenario. And so, and originally, this was set to occur in a will, and the terms of that sale will be outlined in that will. So let's play through that scenario for a second. So if the farm was held by Dale through his lifetime, and then at his passing was inherited by the children with this option to purchase, the basis in that farm would have stepped up to either the productivity value or fair market value on Dale's date of death. And so that would be the new basis then for the children. And then at that point, the child that would like to purchase the farm from the other two siblings could do that, and there would be fairly minimal income tax consequences as a result, because the basis and the productivity value or the value of the farm would be fairly similar. And so in that scenario, the tax owed would probably be largely based on the interest rate associated with the note, and that's what the siblings, the siblings that were being bought out would have to pay income tax on. Now, if this were purchased during life, as I think that's the path that Dale and Karl are going down, this farm would then be subject to capital gains without further planning. So let's just assume for a minute that no further planning is occurring here. Dale's basis would be essentially what he bought the farm for, and then the gain would be whatever the productivity value is minus the basis, and that's what capital gains tax would be paid if it were lump sum. If it is an installment note, then it could be spread out over 20 years, and then the interest rate would be taxed as ordinary income. Now, a couple things that I heard Karl mention was the use of the homestead and excluding some of that gain associated with that. Now, when you sell a home, you can exclude up to $500,000 of capital gains. So if part of the sale was deemed the sale of a home, you could exclude some of that gain for Dale. And so that would be an interesting planning opportunity there to shield some of the farm sale from gain. And then the other thing I heard was a use of an exchange too as well. And I assume we're referencing a 1031 exchange. And that's really the process of selling the property and finding a replacement property within a certain period of time. And if that's done appropriately, that gain could then be essentially avoided for the time being. However, the basis in that property would still be the same in the new property. And then whenever that property was sold, would be taxable. And so there are a lot of interesting fact sets within this case. And in working with a number of families over the years, there could be some tax mitigation opportunities available, in particular for those that are philanthropic and want to give funds to charity. And so our firm frequently uses charitable remainder trusts or use of donor advised funds to help offset some of the gains owed when these farms are sold or farm machinery is sold. You can get very creative in terms of how you structure the sale to either mitigate some of the taxes or defer some of the taxes down the road. And so those were my observations in terms of the tax implications of the sale of the Stanton farm and the farm in Northeast Iowa. And it was a pleasure hearing your story, Dale, and Karl, the work that you've done. And I certainly will hang around here and answer any questions that may have popped up.
Thank you, Matt. And Karl did have one clarification that the only property that he's selling right now is the homestead so that he does avoid capital gains. And then Dale and Sonny will hold the rest until death when the basis will be stepped up and it will pass under the will with the option for the child to buy the rest at productive value. Dale and Karl, do you have any other clarifications to Matt's very nice assessment for not having worked with you before? That was pretty impressive.
Yeah, I get overwhelmed when I talk to these people or listen to them. This is Dale. We owned the Stanton farm that we sold to Mark by means of, we bought it from my mother before she died. So presumably she had some tax burdens that I never worried about, and she helped us with the payments. But when we sold it to Mark, we certainly had capital gains to pay on the increased value from what we bought it for and what we sold it for. So we weren't, the kind of bewildering thing is we're so clear on our goal, we don't worry about the details. We got to make this happen. It's for my hometown. But no, we've gotten, and I can't remember whether I said it relative to Karl, we also got some really helpful professional planning advice from the financial advisor, I guess that's the right word, that our bank employs and made available us to use. It was extraordinarily helpful talking about this. Thank you.
Karl, did you have some clarification?
Yeah, the way the idea of the like-kind exchange came in, and we haven't done that obviously, but could, is that Dale's son that's interested in buying the home farm is already on a small farm, and he has a son living in town, and that son wanted to move to Dale's son's farm, and there would be capital gain if that whole farm was sold too, and it'd be hard for the grandson to buy the whole thing from the son financially. And so what the idea was there is we separated out the homestead on that farm as well. So there won't be any capital gains on that transaction from Dale's son to his grandson. And then that would leave the surrounding land on each farm. You'd have Dale's son living on Dale's farm and surrounded by Dale's farmland. If they wanted to, they could take some of that farmland and swap it out so that Dale would end up owning the farmland around his grandson. And if they wanted to, they could do the same kind of thing there with something where it eventually gets sold at productivity value pursuant to a will or something. But we didn't have to go that far. Right now, all we're doing is we're keeping Dale's will in place with the sale option at productivity value. But what's going to be left now will be pretty much bare land. And the son will already homestead surrounded by that bare land. And so that's how that's working.
Great. Now it's time for everybody else to ask questions. So you can either raise your hand or put something in the chat box saying you have a question. And as you're populating your questions, I'll ask a couple. One is, I'm curious for Karl and Matt, whether you see something like this frequently. And the other question is, if the son or the child does not decide to buy it at productive value after the death, then what happens? Does it go for market value, or does it go to productive value to somebody else in the community?
Okay, I'll maybe take that question. If the son didn't want to buy the property at death, then the property would just become the property of the estate at first, and the estate has two options. You could either sell the property, in which case the three children would receive the proceeds in equal shares, sell it to a stranger, or it could, the estate could be closed with the three children each owning a 1/3 interest in the farm as tenants in common. And then if that happened, they could keep it as long as they wanted, owning it together. They could rent it or whatever, or they could at some point decide to sell it. So that's how that would work.
And Karl, is this the first one of these you've worked on at productive value, or have you worked with other clients?
No, I've never had another client come in interested in solving this kind of a dilemma where, he wanted to be as fair as possible with all three children, but on the other hand, only one really wanted to farm that land. And it was kind of he's on the horns of a dilemma. How do you do this? And if we just said, well, you can buy it for X number of dollars, that price might be ridiculously low 20 years from now, and it might be really unfair. So the challenge was trying to come up with a formula that would be productivity value and fair and would still be useful a long time into the future. And so I worked on it, and this is what I was able to come up with. But yeah, most this was Dale's a special client. He had a special problem, and I came up with a special solution for him. but it might be something other people would be interested in.
Yeah, perhaps. Matt, same question for you. Have you encountered this before? And then we have a question after that for Dale.
Thanks, Sally. Yeah, I have encountered this before, and the situation often kind of breaks down because of the purchase price that's required to buy out the other siblings. So one of the things that we've helped clients with before in doing is kind of pulling apart the assets of the farming operation, whether that be machinery, operating assets, like an operating entity and the land, into separate entities to allow the beneficiaries that are not going to farm the land own the income producing assets like the farm, and the on-farm heir to have the operating assets. And it allows the farm to stay in the family and the whole family to own a piece of it and be rewarded for it in situations where a sale is not feasible. So I seem to be running more and more into those situations where the farm is not wanting to be sold. Great,
thank you. And Dale, a question for you from Jen. How did you know that Mark and Melanie were the right fit for your desire to sell to good people in your community? Did you and your family already know them, or did you sit down with them a few times, or how did you make sure that was a good match? And Faith, if you want to answer these questions too, we can unmute your microphone.
Well, the honest answer is it was by a telephone call. I got the name from the pastor, called up Mark. He thought I was probably interested in something else. I said, assumed he couldn't afford it. And I said, we'll work with you. So that's how it worked out. Just one call.
So was it just a feeling?
Yeah, I guess so. I mean, there was a lot to talk about as we went along, and in terms of what we required them to do, in terms of figuring out how affordable it was, and finding out about his family, his kids who wanted to farm, which is one of the real reasons why Mark was interested in it, because he had two boys, wanted to be farmers, and he didn't have a farm. Well, he had more boys than that, but at least two of them that wanted to be farmers. So it was a really satisfying thing.
And I know that Dale and his siblings have been able to come back and see Mark's farm. And I know, was it in 2018 he had a field day and you were all able to come back, and he's said they picked good. So I think that's been a good match.
You bet that, yes, I think that's what we said and more. It was the most satisfying afternoons that I've been to see that old land in a production system with livestock and a kind of cropping and cover cropping and mixture with this and that we were never smart enough to pull off, and Mark's got that going, and I thought, that's on our farm.
Yeah, so at that field day, Mark showed some of the water quality testing they'd done with the Iowa Soybean Association, as well as some of the small grains they'd raised and are raising, and then his neighbor had been grazing cover crops over there, so a lot of neat stuff going on. And we do have resources, a lot of resources for both people wanting to transfer farms, as well as for landowners. Jorgen can put those into our chat box here. You're welcome to sign up for any of those resources. And Dale and Sunny are actually featured in our summer magazine, which is just getting ready to go to print this week. And in that magazine, there is more details on the transfer to the Petersons, including some of the work that Mark did in order to calculate the affordable land price. So there's more there too. And we would love to have everybody on the call participate in more of our work.
If I could just interject, the last thing you talked about in terms of resources, where can you find these people, I think is very, very important service. I remind you of that writer in Minnesota who said today about Dale's purchase. he really lucked out. And we did. She was perceptive. You aren't going to just, it's not going to fall in your lap like it.
Yep.
And your resources could help be a little bit more assured that that could happen. Thank you.
We do have an upcoming event that will be virtual this year, of course, but it's an event for aspiring farmers and farmland owners, and part of that is just kind of a meet and greet to help create these relationships, because it is very apparent, especially depending on people's goals, that it needs to be a good match. It's kind of like a marriage. You know, you need to continue to transfer together and have some shared values. Okay, audience, there's a lot of you on here. What questions do you have for Dale or Karl or Matt? And they can have nothing to do with Karl's situation, but a question for your own situation. Don't be shy. Well, do any of the three of you have any parting words or reflections to share after hearing each other present?
If I might, when we started trying to figure out another way to get our Decorah farm sold to our son, I sat down with my own spreadsheet and figured out a plan whereby it would be affordable, and this is what would happen, and this would happen. And I took it to the financial planner at our bank, who listened very patiently. Let me explain all this. And he said, you really have collected some nice data and have been thinking really hard about this. And in effect, not this blunt, but he said, you don't want to do that. And he was right. We didn't want to do that. We really needed professional help. I was trying to pull this off myself, and I did not have the skills. And I'd readily point that out to everybody listening.
And I think that's also a good point, that a lot of times this planning takes time, and a lot of times the initial plan changes as you learn more or as your goals change. So it's always good to start somewhere, even if it's on your own, because then that can feed into what kind of help you need and what is possible. Okay, so Kim is asking if we track how many people utilize and find a farm or farmer via Find a Farmer. Kind of, but not very well. So we know how many people have signed up for it. We only know if people have made a successful match if they report that to us. And sometimes we'll periodically ask that. But it's a pretty hands-free service because we want people to have autonomy. We've gotten more requests to maybe have a little bit more involvement in making those batches. So that could be on the radar for us as we move forward, because it is an obvious need. Like you said, you know, it's hard to find the right match, and sometimes that takes some relationship building and also just some conversations to see if it is right fit. Jen says, it sounds like your situation, Dale, had a lot of family harmony. What percentage of farmland succession situations are like that versus situations where there is tragically lots of conflict? And then how can that conflict be avoided?
Well, I guess that question might be for me. And I guess all I can say is it doesn't matter what the percentages are. What matters is what the client's particular situation is. And you just have to talk to the client and figure that out. I mean, Dale knows his children. He had talked to them. He knew the situation. I've seen other situations where the siblings are at each other's throats, and you know, now you've got a different situation to deal with, I suppose. And you just take each case as it comes.
Matt, do you have any reflection on that?
Yeah, I tend to see a lot of conflict in these situations. And so, you know, and many times I find when there is conflict, it's because there's a lack of communication. And, you know, I encourage my clients often to, you know, have a family meeting, talk to their children about what their plans are for the future. And, you know, don't be shy about sharing what your plans are in your will. You know, that can really help to have those conversations before you figure all that out at the attorney's office, what's going to happen. And so I think communication is key, and having a professional team facilitate that conversation for the family can also be very helpful.
Yeah, and I think that's one thing that historically it's been a little bit of a stigma to talk about these things. It'll be, you know, some farmers are like, well, we'll find out what their wishes were after they die. And, you know, farmland owners have the ability to change that by having those conversations. And there are facilitators and mediators out there that can help have these family conversations that can serve as a good neutral third party. Matt, you work regularly with Rena, and she is one of those people. And does she work? She works for Transition. You can say the name.
Transition Point.
Yep.
Transition Point Business Advisors, correct?
Yep. And so she is excellent, and there are others out there like her. So feel free to reach out to myself or Jorgen, and we can try to connect you with somebody in your area. There's plenty of people to help have those conversations. And even if it's not contentious, sometimes it's just good to make sure everybody's voices are heard in those conversations.
Can I make a response a little bit to that? And this came from Practical Farmers of Iowa, one of Mr. Franzen at New Hampton, I believe. Do I have that name right? Within the family, he suggested this takes a long time to work these things out. So they had not one, but several family conferences. And every single one, he started by saying, your mother and I are going to decide what we're going to do. But we'll listen to ideas you have and where you think and so on. And that statement at the beginning, that sentence at the beginning, your mother and I are going to decide what we're going to do without your influence, but we'll listen. and when that went on about several times over a few years, it freed up, because it is a very difficult conversation to have, and it really helped the conversation by saying, we'll listen, but we're going to decide. And it made for more comfortable conversation than I would think it would be difficult.
Yeah, and I imagine, Dale, since you've been having these conversations, it makes it, the more you have them, the easier it makes it, even if people don't always agree, but it's kind of practicing and using that muscle. We do have a question from Don. He is wondering if Matt or Karl, either on you, has seen an example where part of a farm has been sold to a third party while the child who was operating retained his or her share.
You know, that's certainly an option. You know, and that again, every situation is unique. Maybe the farm operation needs to be operated as a unit, or maybe part of it can be sold off and provide some cash for the estate to give some cash to some of the children, and some farmland to another. You know, that's another way to help with the cash flow, especially, you know, I mean, some of these farms aren't even really all in one piece. You have a piece down the road a mile or two, and so on. So, I mean, every situation is unique. It's, you know, coming up with a plan on something like this is like tailoring a suit. Everybody has a different need.
Thank you. Matt?
You know, that is a situation that is very uncommon. I've in fact, working with quite a few families over the years, I've never seen that situation occur. But, you know, to Karl's point, you know, every situation is a little bit different, and there may be circumstances where that makes a lot of sense.
Great. Well, thank you. We have time for one more or two more questions. I will give you an opportunity to ask questions, and in the meantime, I'll kind of close us out here. Thanks everybody for joining us today to both listen and learn, and to Dale, Karl, and Matt to present and help us learn more. And thank you, Dale, for being willing to share your story. It takes some courage to do, but it really helps all of us understand and gives us options for moving forward. As Jorgen said in the chat box, we will give you a really short survey at the end of this. When Zoom closes, it will just prompt you for a survey, and it's short, so please take it to help us learn how to do more of these. And you will be entered into a drawing for a PFI water bottle, and who doesn't want that? So that alone is worth taking it. Let's see, have we had, oh, okay, so we've talked a lot about the importance of finding the right advisor, but not every attorney or financial planner is equipped to answer these questions. Karl and Matt, can you talk about how to find the right advisor with the right skills? Maybe even some questions to ask, because often people don't know what they don't know, and we want to make sure people are connected with the right expertise.
Well, I get phone calls quite often, asking who do you recommend and so on. If they're from outside the area, I'm probably not going to have a good answer for them. One thing I should say is that sometimes word of mouth is a good way to go. If you have friends that have been through something and they talk around, they might you might have several of them saying, "Oh, this is a good way to go," or "not a good way to go." But yeah, it's difficult. I mean, there are publications that have ratings. Like Martindale Hubbell has rating. Now I'm just a sole practitioner, so that doesn't really give me a lot of opportunity to specialize in something. Sometimes it's better to go to a huge law firm where they have somebody that does nothing but estate planning, for example. What I tend to do is I tend to take a lot of oddball situations and try to craft something unusual. That doesn't make me the best one necessarily. So I don't know what county you're checking from, but I'm going to guess if you talk to some other of your friends there, they might have some ideas on that.
Great, thank you, Karl. Matt, you can respond, and then I have one last question that I hear a lot, so it'll be a good question to end on.
Yeah, I could probably shed a little light on the financial planner piece of that. And, in our industry, it's very uncommon for advisors to work with folks that have non-traditional assets like farmland. And so it's very common to work with clients that have traditional assets like stocks and bonds, and, have life insurance needs and need for long-term care insurance. And so my suggestion is to interview several firms, but look for firms that are considered fee only. And what that means is they don't get compensated for selling product. They simply get paid for the advice that they provide. And in our opinion, that eliminates some conflicts of interest. And so that will get you pointed in the right direction. And, certainly having a certain level of rapport with that person is going to go a long way, because it is about communication. So that's key.
Yeah, that's a good tip with the fee only. Okay, so we're going to close it out with a popular question, which does not have an easy answer. Walbert's asking, what should siblings do if the father/farmer does not want to discuss succession? So take it away, any of you.
Well, I don't know. I mean, if not, I think it's like Dale said, the owner, the father, the parents, they're the ones that are going to make the decision, and they'll do what they're going to do. And if the siblings don't want to discuss it, that's okay. It's not really their decision to make anyway.
Matt, do you have different perspective on that?
Well, it's tough. I mean, you can try locking them in a room and getting them to talk and interrogating them, but that's probably not going to work. So, I mean, I think, you know, if they're unwilling to talk about it, you can only push the issue so far. But, you know, if you explain the reasons why you want to have the conversation and help them see a little bit more insight into why that might be important for you and why you need to know some of this information for your planning down the road, that might help them understand why you're seeking that information. And so, like everything, communication is key.
Yeah, like I said, that's a question we get a lot. And I even had one of the older generation call and say, what are you trying to sell? Because her son was trying to get us to go to the Map of My Kingdom play. And I think she did end up going, and that's a good thing. So I think even education is good if we can provide our parents education in a non-pressured way, and maybe they can slowly come around to having some of those conversations. Again, it's their decision, as you said, Karl, but perhaps some resources will help them be able to be willing to talk about it.
I would think every single field day PFI sponsors, somewhere out in the field, people are talking and wondering, what are you doing with your son? What's your dad saying? So I think PFI is in a position to encourage conversation.
Yep.
Thank you for
And,
what you do.
you know, one of the strongest things about Practical Farmers is our network. So I think that's a great plug and message to leave it on is get people to PFI events. Even if they aren't specifically about farm transfer, it just gets them into the door and used to talking about some things on the farm that people don't always talk about. So that's one way to try to grease the wheels toward having that conversation. Again, thank you all for joining us, and especially to our presenters. When we close this, you'll have that survey to take, and I hope you all have an enjoyable evening.